Welcome back to the second part of this introduction to Kant's ethics. This episode is about a very important concept in Kant's ethics, the good will. We will also look at the types of action that Kant distinguishes and examine them at the end using a concrete example. But first, a brief recap of the content from the last video in which we learned about the basics of Kant's ethics. We have learned that Kant's ethics is a normative ethics, in which binding rules are laid down according to which people should act. It is an ethics of reason that judges actions with reason and not emotion. It is a deontological ethics in which the concept of duty plays a special role. We will take a closer look at what Kant means by duty in a moment. And finally, Kant's ethics is an ethics of conviction. Conviction, the intention to act, the motive for the action, is important, not the consequences of the action. Kant's view of man is very important for understanding his ethics. According to Kant, man is both a rational being and a sensory being. He has a sensory and a rational part. Reason refers to the human ability to gain knowledge and make judgments. When it comes to judgments in relation to human action, moral judgments, we speak of practical reason. Kant wants to find a clear and universally valid criterion for evaluating human actions. He asks himself the question, what is good without limitation? To answer this question, he first examines what people usually consider to be good, namely the so-called natural gifts, the qualities that people have by nature, and the gifts of fortune people owe to fortunate circumstances, to fate. Kant divides natural gifts again into talents of the mind, that is mental abilities, and qualities of temperament, that is character traits. Here are a few examples. Intelligence and humor are talents of the mind. Courage and persistence are qualities of temperament. These are natural gifts, characteristics that someone has or does not have by nature. Power or wealth are gifts of fortune. So it depends on luck, on fate, whether you become powerful or rich, no matter how talented or hardworking you may be by nature. Kant now examines whether these qualities can be called good without restriction. The answer is no. The gifts of nature can become evil and harmful if the attitude, the motive for acting, Kant speaks of the will, is bad. A terrorist with a sharp mind can plan and carry out a terrible attack that kills thousands of people. A mean teacher can use humor to constantly make jokes about his students, exposing and hurting them. There are courageous suicide bombers and persistent stalkers. Natural gifts are therefore bad if the intention to act, the will, is bad. Now to the gifts of fortune. Are power and wealth unreservedly good? Here too, Kant's answer is no. They can lead to arrogance and be misused. Adolf Hitler was very powerful, but abused his power for unbelievably terrible crimes, such as the Holocaust. The U.S. investment banker Jeffrey Epstein used his wealth to finance a ring for the sexual exploitation of minors. Only goodwill is good without limitation. In general, will means the motive for the action, the attitude. More precisely, for Kant, the will is the human ability to determine one's own actions. On the basis of his reason, man is able to act according to the principles of reason, and thus according to self-imposed goals. As rational beings, they have autonomy. In order to be able to judge whether actions are moral, the will must be considered in Kant's ethics of conviction. The will is good if it is determined exclusively by practical reason and is guided by the moral law. The moral law is nothing other than the famous categorical imperative, which will be discussed in the next episode. Two further terms are important in connection with the human will. Duty is that which human reason dictates or prescribes. Inclinations are needs, personal interests, desires, and feelings. What can influence the human will? In this graphic, you see man as a sensory being and a rational being. Man has a sensory and a rational side. On the sensory side, inclinations and expected consequences influence the human will. People are guided by needs, desires, and feelings. They also consider what consequences their actions might have. On the rational side, the moral law influences the human will. The moral law corresponds to the categorical imperative. Since humans are not only rational beings, but also sensory beings, the moral law does not automatically or objectively determine the human will. He must respect it subjectively. With what you know about Kant's ethics so far, You can probably already guess which influences Kant approves of and which he does not. Right! Reason, the moral law, should determine the human will, not inclinations or possible consequences of action. In order to understand even more precisely how Kant describes and judges actions, we will now take a look at the different types of action that Kant distinguishes. Kant distinguishes between 3 different types of action. There are actions contrary to duty, which contradict the moral law. Then there are dutiful actions, which are motivated either by immediate inclinations or by egoism. And then there are actions from duty which are determined by pure respect for the moral law. The actions contrary to duty contradict the moral law, they contradict the categorical imperative. They are therefore clearly immoral. The maxim or rule of action on which the action is based cannot be intended as a universal law. Then there are dutiful actions. They comply with the moral law and are therefore legal. In these actions, however, the human will is not exclusively determined by reason, the subjective respect for the moral law, but either by immediate inclinations, certain feelings or needs, or by selfish intentions, egoism. These are therefore either dutiful actions out of direct inclination or dutiful actions without direct inclination, and thus out of selfish intent. According to Kant, these actions are legal, but not moral. And finally, there are actions from duty. These are determined by pure respect for the moral law, exclusively by reason. This means that the action is performed solely because the underlying rule of action, maxim, can be willed as a universal law. Only the moral law, the categorical imperative, influences the human will here, not immediate inclinations or selfish intentions. An action from duty is done out of pure respect for the moral law. According to Kant, only then is the will good and the action moral. Finally, let's illustrate Kant's types of action with an example. The example of the honest merchant or salesman. Salesman A is a dishonest salesman. He sells products to children who are not yet good at math at a higher price than they actually are. He pockets the difference. This is an act contrary to duty. The action is contrary to the moral law. It is clearly immoral. The maxim, cheat children when shopping, cannot be intended as a universal law. With such a universal law, children would no longer want to or be allowed to shop alone. In addition, every business, including shopping, is based on the principle of honesty. A universal law that prescribes fraud would be inherently contradictory. The maxim would destroy itself with such a universal law. Salesman B likes children and therefore sells them the products at fair prices. Here, the action is in accordance with the moral law, but the motive for action, the attitude, the will, is not determined exclusively by reason, respect for the moral law, but by inclinations, namely sympathy for his customers. The action is legal, but not moral. Salesman C does not like children, but he doesn't want any trouble with his boss or the parents of the cheated children. That's why he doesn't take advantage of anyone and demands fair prices from everyone. Here, too, the action is in accordance with the moral law, but the motive for the action, the attitude, the will, is not determined exclusively by reason, nor by an immediate inclination. The salesman does not like children, but by egoism. This action is also only legal, but not moral. Salesman D doesn't like children or his job. He knows that his boss never checks up on him and is sure that nobody would catch him cheating. Nevertheless, he treats all customers honestly and demands fair prices from everyone. This is now an action from duty. The will is determined exclusively by the moral law. Only this action is moral. This example shows that at first glance, there is no real difference between actions from duty and dutiful actions. All 3 salesmen B, C, and D treat their customers honestly and demand fair prices. But the motive for the action, the attitude, the will, differs. And according to Kant, this attitude determines whether an action is moral or merely legal. In Kant's ethics, only the motive, the attitude, the will, determines whether an action is moral or merely legal. If the will is determined exclusively by reason, by pure respect for the moral law, the will is good and the action is moral. The result of the action is irrelevant. Now, of course, we are keenly interested in what this moral law actually is, which alone is supposed to determine the human will. This is what the next episode is about.